In this video, we are going to move from the Industrial Revolution in period 3 to new imperialism in period 3. Now, keep in mind that these events are happening concurrently, simultaneously. Okay, so they're not consecutive as in one happens and then the other. We see that they're happening at the same time between the period of 1750 to 1900. So in the Schoology page, I have made available a worksheet that compares and contrasts old imperialism with new imperialism. So real quick, I'm just going to give a recap of old imperialism. Remember that old imperialism occurred in period 2, which is from 1450 until 1750. And it's going to be started in the Iberian Peninsula. This is going to start the age of exploration. So Spain and Portugal are both trying to get to the spice trade in Asia. Portugal goes around the tip of Africa to get access to the spice trade. Spain hires for Columbus to sail west, and instead of landing in India or in China, he ends up landing in the New World, which had previously, other than the Vikings, had not had contact with the Old World. Now, remember that the motivations behind old imperialism were the 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. So we're going to see the spread of Catholicism, we're going to see the desire for wealth, and of course, the conquistadors and the empires are going to want to gain glory for themselves and to get their own golden age. Okay, so they went to Asia for spices, but then through happenstance came across the New World. Thus, we're going to see the Columbian Exchange emerge during the Age of Exploration, which creates a triangular trade from Europe to Africa to the Americas and then back to Europe. Okay, so remember that Portugal was the first one to find an alternative route to the spice trade. Spain discovers the New World, and as a result, we're going to see that the 2 countries have to come to a compromise about who gets what in the New World. Now, there are already people living in the New World. There are already mighty civilizations there. But due to the lack of immunity to smallpox and the lack of metal weaponry like gunpowder technology in particular, the Europeans are going to be able to colonize the New World, whereas they're not able to colonize Africa and Asia during period 2. So Portugal and Spain are going to divide up the New World with the Treaty of Tordesillas, and thus we're going to see that the Spanish dominate the New World up until about 1588. Now, what happened there was Spain tried to invade England because England's queen, Queen Elizabeth I, had executed the next in line to the English throne, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic. So Spain rolls up into England, but against all odds is defeated. Once the Spanish Armada is defeated by the English, that opens up the New World for exploration by the British and by the Dutch and the French. So we see the end of the Golden Age for Spain and Portugal, and other European countries start getting involved in exploration, not only setting up trading posts along the African coast to get to Asia, but also colonizing in the New World to establish a mercantilist economy. We're going to see that Spain moves in and establishes a huge empire, as we can see with this area in red that indicates the territories that they claimed in the Treaty of Tordesillas. But then eventually the English are going to get involved here on the eastern coast of North America, which, as we know, is going to lead to the establishment of the United States after the American Revolution. Now, new imperialism, in contrast, is going to happen in period 3, beginning around 1870. Okay, so as the Industrial Revolution led to an increase in wealth due to the new technologies that were developed. But we're going to see that with new imperialism, there's going to be a need for new markets as well as natural resources. Now, the revolutions that had been spurred by the Enlightenment in the New World had made the former colonies in the New World independent countries. So Britain can't demand cash crops from the United States because it's no longer a colony. Spain can't demand resources from its former colonies in Latin America. Portugal can't claim cash crops from Brazil, okay, because they've established their independence from the mother countries. And so in the search for natural resources and a captive market, that's going to shift the goal of imperialism away from the New World and back to the Old World, namely in Africa and in Asia. So the causes of new imperialism, okay, we're going to talk about four of them. We're going to talk about economic, religious, political, and social causes. Number one, economic causes. There is a search for new markets and raw materials. The colonizing countries had lost their colonies due to the revolutions inspired by the Enlightenment, and so they want to establish new ones. Okay, so they want a captive market and raw materials like cash crops like cotton. Number two, religious causes. Again, like with old imperialism, there is a desire to spread Christianity. And so missionaries are going to move into Africa and into Asia to try and proselytize. Now, this is going to be used as a justification for colonization, because as missionaries go into these civilizations, they're not always going to be welcome, okay, because it's a foreign culture. And so if missionaries get in trouble or they get attacked, their mother countries are going to use that as a justification to invade and send in military forces. Political causes for new imperialism include competing with other imperial powers. Britain obviously got a head start because the Industrial Revolution started in Britain, but we're going to see this scramble for colonies emerge as nationalism increases. Basically, these European countries are going to want to prove that they're the biggest and the baddest, and in order to prove that, they try to build empires. And to try to build an empire, you need to take colonies. So they're going to be competing with each other politically. Remember, with the balance of power, you don't want any one country getting too powerful, and so they try to basically keep up with each other. In terms of social causes, we're going to see an increase in nationalism. Okay, so like extreme patriotism, the belief that your country is the best and all other countries are inferior, and a development of a philosophy known as the white man's burden. Now, I have attached a worksheet on that, an activity in the Schoology page for y'all to look at there. The white man's burden is based in social Darwinism. I guess a shorter way to say that would be racism. The white man's burden was idealized as the idea that European countries were somehow superior. They had the best civilizations, and so they used that as a justification to force their culture onto other areas. So they really use this as a way to say, hey, we're actually doing a favor by colonizing Africa and Asia because we're bringing them our quote unquote superior culture and civilization. Now, obviously, that is going to be very hypocritical, seeing as all of these areas outside of Europe had golden ages long before Europe did. While Europe was in the dark ages, literally everywhere else in the world was having a great time. Okay, so we're going to see that this is going to be a justification for colonization through the use of racism and ethnocentrism. Now, European nations had engaged in trade with these countries before, but they're no longer going to be content to just trade. They want to directly rule. So they want natural resources, particularly as it relates to cash crops. These cash crops can include tea, cotton, sugar, cocoa, and opium, as we'll see in India when the British colonize India and start growing opium to import into China to maintain a more favorable trade balance. Now, the issue, well, one of the issues with this focus on cash crops is that the colonies are going to be forced to grow these crops and basically these crops only. This is going to create a monoculture, monoculture, a monoculture, meaning that they're growing one crop. This is going to lead to a lack of agricultural diversity. It's going to drain resources out of the land, and it's also going to lead to population instability with the lack of food resources. Okay, so Europe wants natural resources like cash crops. They want new markets that have to buy from the mother country, and they want cheap labor. Okay, now we do see a global trend away from coerced labor during this time, particularly as labor unions in Britain fight to end slavery because it lowers wages back in the mother country. But we're still going to see that the European countries are going to try to maximize their profits through these colonies, because colonies are going to be export economies. Okay, they're not supposed to enrich themselves, they're supposed to enrich the mother country. So cash crops grown in the colonies are going to Europe, and then Europe is going to manufacture goods based on those raw materials that they receive from the colonies. And then the colonies become captive markets, meaning they have to buy from the mother country. Now, imperialist powers in Europe, but also in Asia, such as Japan, are going to seize their colonies and establish protectorates or spheres of influence. So again, with white man's burden and social Darwinism, we're going to see old-fashioned racism. Here we see caricatures of countries, basically anthropomorphizing them. Here we see England. This is Russia/Germany, Russia, France, and Japan. These are the imperial powers of period 3. Now, what we see here is that they're dividing up a pie of China. So they're basically fighting with each other over who gets what part of China as a captive market. Now, obviously, China is not going to be very pleased with this. And in these political cartoons, of course, you see racist imagery and racial caricatures. And so we see, again, that idea of social Darwinism and the white man's burden. Okay, so here we see just a graph of the effects of imperialism on the colony. So we see all of this wealth that's being amassed, but it's been carved out of the colonies. So like the Latin American colonies and Africa, their resources are going to be stolen from them and used to enrich the imperialist nations. Now, the United States does go through the Industrial Revolution, and they are going to become an industrial nation, actively competes with European countries for these influences in these colonies. Now, we skipped over spheres of influence. If you haven't heard this term before, a sphere of influence means that they haven't colonized the area as in, well, not directly, they don't claim it as their territory. So it's not a colony, but these spheres of influence in China are going to be economically dominated by Europe, especially as Europe gets involved in managing the Qing dynasty. Okay, so they're not technically a colony, but they're still going to be dominated politically, socially, and economically by imperial powers, as we see in this political cartoon. So what are the causes or the motives for imperialism? Y'all may have remembered that in old imperialism, we have the 3 Gs, God, gold, and glory. We're going to see similar motivations with new imperialism. Industrialists need raw materials to fund the Industrial Revolution. And so they need to find new sources of those raw materials and captive markets for those goods. The main cash crop that's going to be desired for the main cash crop that we're going to see a focus on for Britain in particular is going to be cotton. Okay, so they're going to try to raise as much cash crops in terms of cotton, because cotton as a raw material can then be imported to Europe and then spun into manufactured goods. Okay, so talking about the colonies that they established in the Congo, which is in Africa. Okay, these people in the Congo are going to represent captive markets, meaning that the British cotton spinners create clothing, and then they're going to sell that clothing for a profit to the people in the colonies. And again, under mercantilism, they're going to have to buy from those mother countries. Now, we're going to see that nationalism is going to increase during this time. Nationalism meaning that they believe that their nation is the best nation. And so they're going to want to prove that by establishing an empire. So political causes of imperialism include the desire to build an empire, asserting your national identity. For in particular, Germany is going to unify in 1871, and they're going to want to that they are an imperial nation like the other European nations. We're also going to see, obviously, economic desires for raw materials and profit, but really we're seeing a desire to outdo the other countries. So all of these European countries are going to be competing with each other to prove who is the biggest and the best empire, to become superpowers, essentially. Okay, so here we see Germany in this political cartoon taking chunks out of the world, indicating the expansion of their empire under new imperialism. So here we see again that white supremacy in terms of social Darwinism and racist ideology that justifies imperialism. All over the globe today, we see the peoples of Europe creating a mighty aristocracy of the white races. So clearly you can see race playing a role in this. The colonizing impulse has become a vital question for a great nation, basically saying Germany needs to catch up with the rest of the Europeans. If we don't, then we are missing out, okay? Because England is the one that has colonized over 1/3 of the world. Remember the saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. So it's saying we must and we will take our share in the domination of the world by the white race. This is coming from Germany. So very clearly, race plays a role, like it played a role in old imperialism when we look at the establishment of the racial hierarchy in the New World with the casta system. Okay, but Germany is not going to be the only one that has this ideology. We see the same thing in France, basically saying that our language and our customs and our arms and our genius, and in terms of France saying this, is the best, and we need to spread this influence to better benefit the rest of the world. So again, this idea of superiority. So we're going to see this manifest as white supremacy during this time period. Britain, same thing. Okay, they're going to say that they are the best version of humans, that they were the first race in the world, which is not historically accurate. If you look at the out of Africa theory. It is our duty to seize every opportunity to get more territory because we are the best, most human, and most honorable race. So again, if you say that about yourselves, that indicates that you are dehumanizing everyone who does not fit within that category. And that dehumanization is going to allow for justifications of human rights violations and atrocities, most notably when we get into the world wars, particularly with the Armenian genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Holocaust committed by Nazi Germany. So that ideology emerges from this time period of new imperialism. This slide is just as a short recap of it, is just indicating the fact that England is dominating in terms of new imperialism. They are continually gaining more and more territory. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Okay, so an expansive empire there. Now, like I said before, we've mentioned social Darwinism back in the Industrial Revolution. They are going to take a bastardized version of evolution and apply it to society. So Charles Darwin said, hey, theory of evolution, species have some traits that are passed down and some traits that aren't passed down based on how they help the species survive. It's not based on individuals, it's based on a species as a whole. Well, Herbert Spencer is going to take that idea and he's going to try to apply it to society, thus developing social Darwinism. Herbert Spencer is the one who said survival of the fittest or survival of the strongest. Basically, his ideology here is that the poor deserve to be poor, the conquered deserve to be conquered, and Europeans are the most advanced, which is, you know, kind of convenient, seeing as Herbert Spencer is European. Okay, so he's going to consider his culture and his race to be the superior one. Thus, he uses that as a justification for why Europe is colonizing around the world. This is used as a justification for both imperialism and for racism. The author or social Darwinist is going to believe that everyone who is not European or Anglo-Saxon is inferior. Okay, so some very problematic racial characterizations that we see spring out of new imperialism. Again, these old racist stereotypes that trace back to old imperialism used as a justification for what the Europeans do in Asia and in Europe. So these ideas are going to spread through the industrialized nations and essentially give a justification for what they are going to do in the colonies. Now, missionaries are going to be a key factor in the expansion of new imperialism. They believe they have a duty to quote unquote civilize other civilizations or other cultures. The idea that their religion and culture is superior, they're going to take that into the colonies and try to proselytize. Okay, so this is where we get the idea of white man's burden, this kind of idea that, oh, we need to spread our civilization because we're doing a favor to everybody else by doing so, completely ignoring the fact that these civilizations were already civilized and had established their own empires over hundreds of years. Now, at first, these missionaries are going to have good intentions. They have humanitarian and religious motives. However, this is going to lead to an issue where as missionaries move into these colonies and they get into scuffles or they run into trouble, their mother countries are going to use that as a justification to send in the military. Okay, so it's used as a justification to send in military forces and thus colonize that area. Okay, so colonizers are going to follow the missionaries and they're going to be focused on economic gain rather than on religious motives. However, we do see some positive effects of missionary work in new imperialism. The missionaries work to end the slave trade. They establish schools, they establish hospitals, but obviously this is going to be a foot in the door phenomenon of imperial industrialized nations trying to move into areas and claim them as their own. This imperative to spread quote unquote superior culture is known as the white man's burden. And that term comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling. Okay, so this is one of those poems that you're probably going to see again in sophomore year and again in junior year. Basically, it's racist ideology. The idea behind it is that as their quote unquote superiors, Western cultures or countries should take up the burden of civilizing other inferior countries. Okay, so very convenient for the Europeans that they consider themselves the superior race and culture, because then they can use that as a justification for economic profit. Okay, so this is a key part of new imperialism, the idea of ethnocentrism and superiority, thus dehumanizing the people in the colonies and basically treating them as childlike or as less intelligent, even though we all know that is not the case. Also, technological superiority is going to allow for new imperialism. Y'all may remember that in old imperialism, Europe couldn't take over Africa even if they wanted to, or if they tried, they would have been pushed back. The reason for this being that the Europeans were not immune to malaria, which had been spread through the Bantu migrations in Africa in period 1 and period 2. The African empires had already established mighty civilizations that were very wealthy and also had the same military technology as the Europeans. And so it would have been an equal, fair fight. And then, oh, what else was it? Let's see, they had gunpowder technology, they had immunity to malaria. Oh, and the rivers in Africa did not flow into the interior. Okay, so they flowed outward. So if they wanted to go into the interior of Africa by boat to invade in period 2, they would have had to use manpower, which is not as effective. Okay, all of those factors are going to change due to new technology from the second industrial revolution. Remember that the second industrial revolution was from 1870 to 1914, where we see more of a focus on steel and chemicals and electronics. So some of the technology that comes out of the Industrial Revolution includes quinine, which was originally discovered in the New World. It helps with the symptoms of malaria and yellow fever. So that's one push factor that's taken out of the equation. The steam engine is going to allow boats to go upriver into the interior of Africa. So transportation, that's going to help. The telegraph and other communication methods are going to allow for better organization in colonizing. Africa, as well as new military technology, such as the Maxim gun. Now, you've probably heard of the Maxim gun before, but you've heard of it as a machine gun. Obviously, a machine gun is going to be more effective than muskets or regular gunpowder weaponry from period 2. Okay, so with this technological superiority, the Europeans are going to use that new technology to move in and to colonize areas that had previously been off limits to them, thus starting the scramble for Africa, which when we get into the next lecture series that I'm going to create, we'll talk about the scramble for Africa, the colonization of Asia, and the effects of new imperialism. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the scramble for Africa, which is just the term used for the European desire to carve up Africa amongst the different countries as they built their empires. This is going to be the most aggressive example of new imperialism during this time period. Okay, so previously in old imperialism in period 2, the Europeans were unable to colonize Africa for the reasons that we listed earlier. But now that's going to change due to new technology that emerges and the desire for more resources. Okay, so in 1885, the scramble for Africa is going to be established through the Berlin Conference. Otto von Bismarck, who is the leader of Germany at the time, who unifies Germany, is going to try to create a conference so that the European countries don't have to fight with each other over exploiting the African continent. Okay, so these European powers are going to meet together to talk about how they are going to divide Africa amongst themselves. This is also known as the Congo Conference, referring to the area of the Congo in Africa. So within the Berlin Conference, they outline rules to prevent war between the colonial powers of Europe. They say that they're going to check with surrounding imperial powers before taking a territory in Africa. They're going to end the slave trade in Africa, not because they see it as a moral wrong, but because they know that depopulation of the colony is not going to be good for the economy, which is their main focus in imperialism. Now, who wasn't a part of this conference? Well, that would be Africa. Africa was not consulted in the Berlin Conference. Now, this should sound very familiar because the same thing happened in old imperialism. Back when Spain and Portugal got together with the Pope to divide up the New World, they didn't bring in the Native Americans to that treaty. They just said, hey, this belongs to Spain, and hey, this belongs to Portugal. Okay, so a repeat of history from period 2, and that the people living in the territory that's being divided up don't get a say in imperialism. So Britain, France, and Germany are going to carve up Africa. This is another political cartoon like the one that we saw with the spheres of influence in China. So remember that in new imperialism, instead of conquering the New World, they're going to colonize Africa and Asia. Okay, Britain, France, and Germany and other European countries are going to divide up almost all of Africa. The only areas that remain independent are Christian Ethiopia and Liberia. Britain and Egypt in particular are going to be involved together with the Ottoman Empire being the sick man of Europe. They're losing power over their colonies that they established in the African continent like Egypt. And so Britain is going to swoop in for their own economic benefit. So in 1883, Britain and Egypt are going to work to build the Suez Canal, which you may remember earlier this year, the Evergreen boat got stuck in the Suez Canal, thus stopping trade for days at a time. Okay, so the canal is going to be critical for trade. It connects the Red Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. So you no longer have to go around the tip of Africa to get to the Indian Ocean. You can just go through right here. So they're going to carve out a canal right here to connect the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. Egypt is going to borrow money from the Europeans to build this canal, but they're not going to be able to pay it back. So as a result, Britain calls in that debt. They take over Egypt and the Suez Canal from the Ottoman Empire, and they declare Egypt to be a protectorate of the British Empire. So again, we see the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire continuing as we get closer to World War I. Now, one of the most egregious examples of new imperialism is going to occur here in the Congo, and it's going to involve the European country of Belgium. Okay, Leopold II was the king of Belgium. He is going to send H.M. Stanley into Belgium to create treaties with the Congo to transfer land to Leopold. He is going to end up personally, so not the government, but he personally is going to own the Congo territory. Now, why does he want the Congo? Because it has a natural resource of rubber. Okay, so they have rubber trees. There was recently a bicycle craze in Belgium at the time, and so they needed rubber to build bicycle wheels to meet the demand for that bicycle craze in Belgium. So Leopold is going to take government money, okay, so taxpayers' money, and he's going to use it to fund quote unquote missionary work. But instead of actually doing missionary work, he is going to use the money to collect rubber as an export in the Congo, thus exploiting the people in the Congo. As we can see here, okay, they are going to force the people of the Congo to collect rubber, and if they don't meet the quota set by King Leopold II, they are punished severely with punishments such as losing their hands. If people refuse to work, then their entire families are killed as a consequence of that. So very clearly violations of human rights happening in the Congo under Belgium. I believe that they recently recognized and apologized for those atrocities, but this is far after new imperialism ended. So 3 to 8 million people in the Congo are going to die as a result of Belgium colonizing the Congo. Okay, under this one individual king using taxpayer money to personally enrich himself. But Belgium is not going to be the only country involved in colonizing Africa. England is going to be very involved. During the Napoleonic Wars, England is going to replace the Dutch in Cape Colony. And the Dutch that live there are not going to be very happy with this. These descendants of the 17th century Dutch settlers are known as Afrikaneers. Okay, they are white settlers from the Netherlands that had settled in Cape Colony. Now, when the British come in, that's going to spark a Boer War, B-O-E-R. There are multiple of these Boer Wars. The first one was in 1880 until 1881, and the second one was from 1899 until 1902. So the native Africans, the Boers, are going to side with the Afrikaneers, okay, the white Dutch settlers that had lived in Cape Cod. They're going to fight against the British colonizers. Now, unfortunately for the natives of Cape Colony and the Afrikaneers, the British are going to win in those wars. And so the Boers and the Afrikaneers are going to be displaced or moved to poorer land that doesn't have as many resources, because the British are going to claim those resources in the territory with the natural resources. Also, the British are going to come into conflict with other native peoples like the Xhosa people, X-H-O-S-A. From 1811 until 1858, okay, the British are going to be fighting the Xhosa Africans, and again, the British are going to win in that war. Similarly, in the 1870s, the British are going to be in conflict with the Zulu in the Anglo-Zulu War. Again, like with the Boer Wars and the war against the Xhosa people, the British are going to win in those conflicts. So they are going to claim up that area, that territory for themselves. But Africa is not the only continent that's going to be colonized by the Europeans. We also see imperialism in Asia. Trade with China originally had been restricted because they didn't want or need European goods, and because they didn't want inferior cultures coming in and polluting their Confucian culture. Okay, so Britain is going to respond to that by cultivating opium in India. Then they're going to take that opium and sell it in China. Now, the Qing dynasty is going to have a problem with this. They're going to try to stop this drug trade, thus leading to the First Opium War in 1837. Okay, so the Chinese burnt the ships full of opium in their harbors, and so Britain is going to declare war in 1837. Now, at this point in time, Britain has the best navy in the world, and so they are going to win in this first Opium War. This is going to lead to the Treaty of Nanking, Nanking, in 1842. So the first war started in 1837, and then it's going to be ended in 1842. And in this treaty, since Britain was victorious, they are going to take Hong Kong as their territory, as a colony. They are going to make the Chinese pay $100 million in reparations for lost property with the burning of their opium ships, and they force open trade in China. So other European countries are also going to slide into China and start establishing spheres of influence, including the United States. Once they force open trade in China, we're going to see the Taiping Rebellion in 1850, Taiping. This is a rebellion against the Qing dynasty because they're angry with the Qing dynasty for trading with the Europeans. Okay, so this is the idea that, again, the Qing dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven. Now, the Europeans are going to support the Qing dynasty in this revolt because they've already established control over China. So they don't want a new government to rule over China. They want the Qing dynasty to rule because they've already established connections with them. And so Europe is going to get involved and help to put down the rebellion. But basically, the Qing dynasty is toothless because they rely on those foreign powers in order to maintain control. So even though we see here that it says that China is independent, in reality, there are going to be spheres of influence that are established, okay, as China is carved up amongst the Europeans. So Russia's involved, the United States is involved, Japan, Germany, Britain here depicted as a lion. I believe this is France, no, this is Italy, and then this is Austria. Okay, so we're going to see that they're all trying to carve up Asia and establish spheres of influence for their own economic benefit. Now, China, again, is going to fight against the opium trade in their country, thus leading to the Second Opium War in 1856. Again, the Chinese are going to lose this war. The French are involved in during this war as well. And as a result of this war, harsher terms are going to be set against China. So increased European control. This, once again, is going to lead to rebellion. From 1899 until 1901, we see the Boxer Rebellion, also known as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Okay, but Boxer is shorter, so you can just call it the Boxer Rebellion if you like. This is going to be an anti-Western rebellion. So they want Westerners, Europe, and the United States to get out of China and reestablish native rule. It's after this rebellion that the Qing dynasty is going to fall about 11 years later in 1912. Okay, so due to European influence, we're going to see the fall of the Qing dynasty. Also in Asia, oh, and real quick, there's a picture of opium before it's made into opium. In addition to China being colonized and carved up into spheres of influence, we see that another area in Asia, India, is going to be colonized. Britain had defeated France in the 7 Years' War in 1763. They're going to establish dominance in India as a result, as well as taking territory in Canada as well. So the British East Indies Company is going to push France out of India. They're going to maintain control over India as a colony, but we are going to see native independence movements where the Indians do not want to be imperialized and colonized by Britain. One such rebellion is the Sepoy Mutiny, Sepoy, in 1857. The Sepoys were Indian soldiers who were employed by the British. Now, how this mutiny started was that there were rumors of pig and cow fat being put on bullets to convert Hindus and Muslims to Christianity. Now, obviously, that is a very, very rude thing to do due to the Muslim and Hindu restrictions on eating cows and Hinduism, but also the restriction against pork in the Islamic faith. Remember that India is mostly Hindu and Muslim, dating back to the Delhi Sultanate, as well as the Gupta dynasty, Mauryan dynasties, and of course the Mughal dynasty. Okay, so they're going to rebel against the British because they see this as religious persecution. The British want to maintain control of India, and so they are going to respond strongly. They move in and they establish British control of the government with the British Raj, R-A-J. This British Raj is going to rule from 1858 until 1947. Okay, because after World War II, we see a period of decolonization. Okay, so we're not going to see an independent India until after World War II. But we still see resistance to colonial powers with examples like the Indian National Congress in 1885, leading to an increase in Indian nationalism and a desire for self-rule. Okay, but we don't see decolonization until after the Second World War. Now, Japan is an imperial power, okay, but it's only going to become an imperial power because the United States forces it out of its period of isolationism that had been started under the Tokugawa shogunate. Okay, so they have been isolated from 1640 until 1853. And then the United States, led by Matthew Perry, are going to come in with gunboat diplomacy, thus forcibly opening trade with Japan, saying, hey, you need to trade with us or we're going to come in and colonize you. And so Japan is going to recognize, okay, we need to modernize or be colonized. So the Tokugawa shogunate loses power and the Meiji dynasty is going to be restored. This is known as the Meiji Restoration. They're taking power again in 1857, and this is going to move Japan into a period of rapid industrialization. Now, why do they want to industrialize so rapidly? Because they want to be an imperial power. They want to be an empire. They don't want to be a colony. So they copy the British and their industrial miracle in order to become an imperial power. And this is going to pay off. In the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, the Japanese are going to be victorious. So an Asian country defeating a European country. So this is a huge blow to Russia, and it's going to be a great PR movement for Japan. Okay, so they establish themselves as an empire. Then they move into Korea and colonize and annex Korea in 1910. So again, building an imperial empire. Then they're going to invade China in the Sino-Japanese War, Sino being spelled S-I-N-O. That war was in 1895, and like with the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese are also going to be successful in the Sino-Japanese War. This is going to lead to some problematic behavior in World War II with the invasion of China, like we talked about before with the rape of Nanking. And so we're going to see that these imperial powers like Germany and Japan and the Ottoman Empire in World War I are going to commit some human rights violations. Now, what about the United States? Okay, the United States is going to become an imperial power in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Okay, so these countries had established their independence from Spain and Portugal, but then the United States is going to start establishing themselves as an imperial power. Okay, so how this is going to work is that the government of the United States is going to want to expand through manifest destiny. Y'all may remember that with the Mexican-American War from 1845 to 1846, America had gained a lot of territory from Mexico, like Arizona and California and Texas. Thus, under the idea of manifest destiny, they're going to believe that they should continue to expand, that they have the God-given right to take over more territory. Okay, another war that's going to occur due to this belief is the Spanish-American War. So Spain is going to lose that war, which began in 1898. And as a result, the United States is going to get the territories of Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So establishing commonwealths in the New World under the United States. Now, prior to those wars in Manifest Destiny, the Monroe Doctrine is going to be established in 1823, which tells European countries, hey, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Y'all can't colonize over here. This is our territory. So Europe then is going to turn to Africa and Asia instead. Teddy Roosevelt is going to go even further with the Monroe Doctrine by issuing the Roosevelt Corollary, saying that in addition to the Western Hemisphere being off limits to the Europeans, the United States has a responsibility. Okay, so going back to white man's burden, because Teddy Roosevelt did believe in social Darwinism, the responsibility to intervene in unstable Latin American countries. Okay, so this gives them the right, okay, under the Roosevelt Corollary, to go into these independent countries and interfere. Okay, so obviously this is going to be an example of imperialism. So we see imperialism with James Monroe, the president, issuing the Monroe Doctrine, saying, hey, Europe, stay out, this is ours. And then later presidents like Teddy Roosevelt expanding that and saying, okay, this is where we're going to start moving in and establishing our spheres of influence. Now, effects of new imperialism, or consequences of new imperialism, are going to be fairly negative for the colonies and fairly beneficial for the colonizers. Okay, so the new imperialism is going to damage and sometimes even destroy native cultures. You're going to see increased nationalism in the colonies in response to this damage. The colonies are going to want independence. Okay, so increased nationalism, the desire for self-rule. This is going to lead to organized resistance against the imperial power. So for instance, in Africa, we see organized African resistance under Pan-Africanism, which was a sense of shared identity and nationalism. So wanting to get out from under colonial rule, similar to what we saw in the New World as a result of the Enlightenment ideals. Another consequence of new imperialism is that it created the global economy of modern times, meaning that we're all connected. If something economically devastating happens in Asia, then it affects Europe as well as the United States. So all of trade is truly global. And another huge impact is that it is going to lead to the world wars. Okay, in their scramble for colonies, the European countries are going to come into conflict with each other. There's going to be increased rivalries amongst them. Okay, so you see increased militarism, okay, that occurs due to the new military technology of the Industrial Revolution. You see alliances amongst the European countries. That's going to lead to a domino effect of if one country gets into a war with another, then its allies have to join in just because they are allies, not because they have any stake in the conflict. Increased nationalism, the idea that, hey, our country is number one and therefore other countries are inferior. Imperialism is going to increase these rivalries. And finally, the last cause of World War I is assassination, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the Balkans. So again, to recap the causes of World War I, you should think of the mnemonic device MANIA, M-A-N-I-A. Militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. Okay, World War I is in period 4, okay, the last period of AP World History. And remember, there are textbook chapters and outlines and worksheets available for you in Schoology for period 4 if you want to further study that for the AP exam. Okay, but this is the end of the lecture on new imperialism. Okay, so keep in mind, review the worksheets that I've provided, comparing and contrasting old and new imperialism, and make sure you go through those vocabulary terms like social Darwinism, white man's burden, scramble for Africa, monocultures, because remember, those terms represent specific factual information that you can utilize on your free responses.